All right, well, it is time for us to get going. Welcome to our evening of For Life Live. My name is Reverend Jeff Duncan. I'm the Director of Mission and Ministry at Lutherans for Life and hosting again this For Life Live. We do have a web page that archives all of our previous For Life Live activities. I'll make sure I put that up in the chat section. Also, future activities we try to put on our website. If you scroll down from the home page and go to the calendar, you can usually see the connections. I'm going to be posting several of those because we've got several For Life Live planned almost all the way through the end of this year. December is still open for us. And one session in September is open, but the rest of them have been slotted. So next week, or excuse me, not next week, on July 6th, the first Tuesday in July, our session at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time will be with Reverend Michael Solomink, Executive Director of Mission and Ministry for Lutherans for Life. And his topic is going to be Speaking the Truth in Love, Engaging Abortion Advocates' Arguments and Objections. A little synopsis that Reverend Solomink has shared. The Bible doesn't say anything about abortion. It's not a person. My body, my right. If it's illegal, women will die. Don't legislate morality. You can't force rape victims to bear their attackers' children. We shouldn't judge those poor women. Now, those were all statements, obviously. This presentation is going to look into how we can share God's grace sensitively, eloquently, and winsomely in response to these and other invitations. So again, that will be July 6th. And I'll be posting the other sessions and talking about them as they come up. So for tonight, a little bit of a devotion. A man or a woman who desires to dispose of a child in a womb forms that attitude somewhere, that attitude that life is disposable. Likewise, instead of having the patience to care for and provide for their aging parents, and a couple might decide instead to urge them to consider physician-assisted suicide, or even to advocate to bring about their death through some kind of healthcare means. That is a disposable attitude, and it has to come from somewhere. Reading from Scripture, Mark chapter 15. And he, Jesus, called the people to him and said to them, "Hear and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a person." When the disciples came and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?" He answered, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be rooted up. Let them alone. They are blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit." But Peter said to him, "Explain the parable to us." And he said, "Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." Tonight, we're going to be eager with our hearts and open with our minds as we explore and listen to one area where often evil thoughts and idolatries are rampant. Now, you might not have thought of dating and finding a mate in this age as a place where this exists, but I think our author is going to open our eyes to this idea of what comes out of our heart's desires, this selfishness that is within us, and how we apply that, not only in our dating, but also how we apply it in other areas of our life, or how we see this attitude affect us in other areas of our life. So let's begin with prayer. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hidden, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love you and worthily magnify your holy name, through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord. Amen. Welcome, everybody, to this For Life Live and to our presenter, Daniel E. Johnson, the author of Disposable, When Dating is Not Loving Your Neighbor. Dan's going to talk about how so much of our society is now viewed as disposable, not just things that we buy, but also relationships and undesirables, including the unborn, the infirm, the disabled, our neighbor, whom we may see as undesirable and disposable in one way or another. Now, Dan has studied math and physics at the University of Virginia. He earned a PhD in physics from the University of Illinois. So you can call him doctor. He also has served in the United States Air Force as an officer. He's worked his postdoctoral research at the University of Würzburg in Germany. He currently works in the legal field in Silicon Valley. He is a husband of one wife and the proud father of a son, a scientist by profession, a philosopher at heart, and a Christian who believes in an ordered universe. For him, faith and reason are complementary, not contradictory, and he believes they allow us to think about things from different perspectives and explore the world of ideas to arrive at a deeper understanding, thereby impacting our culture. And that's where he's going to talk with us tonight. An intersection of faith, reason, and culture that has fascinated him is how men and women treat each other. And this is what the subject of the book, Disposable When Dating is Not Loving Your Neighbor, is all about. He's been able to test some of the ideas that he's written about and arrived at the presentation for tonight. So I want to extend a warm welcome to our presenter and author, Dan Johnson. Dan, thanks for coming and joining us. And we're going to look forward to hearing a little bit about what you have explored and found in your presentation here, as well as how you want to put this into the hands of those who might benefit from it as well. Dan, welcome. Where's Dan?
Hi, this is Dan Johnson. This is Dan Johnson dialing in. I've been kicked off 3 times.
Oh my goodness.
So it sounds like you can hear me. That's great.
Yes, we can.
I'm sorry it's come to this, but perhaps if you just, Pastor Duncan, toggle through the slides, and I will just talk. How's that? I don't know what to say. This is a problem that comes up once in a while here in California. So
I think we need to get a new governor out there who will propose for good, solid internet for all of the citizens. All right.
And there you go.
All right. Let me get this open to my screen, and I'll tell you when I've got it shared.
Very good.
Can everybody see the slide? And are you still seeing a presenter on the side? Thumbs up if you are. Okay, good enough. Good enough. Dan, I'm on your first slide.
Very good. Okay, so here we go. So this, for me, goes back actually all the way back to high school. And like many of you, I was churched and learned something about the Great Commandments, to love God and your neighbor. But there was another little adage that was floating around, and that was all is fair in love and war. And I could see the way people treated each other was certainly consistent with that all is fair in love and war sentiment. And I posed the question to folks, including professing Christians. I said, how can both be true? I couldn't quite make sense of this. And I really didn't get any satisfactory responses. And so that's sort of started a lifelong quest. Well, what's going on here? How do you make sense of this? Relationships and love and so forth. And so I hope that I answer or address that question tonight. So with that, we can move on to the next slide.
I'm on the slide that says characteristics of the dominant dating.
Very good. Characteristics of the dominant dating culture. Can everyone see the whole thing? So these are some topics I want to discuss tonight. Characteristics of the dominant dating culture. And let me say at the outset that I recognize that dating is practiced by different people in different ways. And so I really want to focus my attention on what I call the dominant dating culture. That is to say, the dating culture that seems to be preeminent or gets most of our attention in our country. So the point is not to condemn anyone who dates or has gone on a date, but rather to examine, if you will, the dominant dating culture and see where it falls short and contrast it with Christian teaching and practice. I'm then going to transition into a short history of marriage, courtship, and dating, which I hope will be both informational and inspirational in the sense that I think you're going to see that the church has played a very positive role throughout history and can continue to do so. Then I'd like to outline a better approach to relationships and really start to present what might be the church's response, articulate a need for sexual purity, and then finally, how do we construct a counterculture, especially with our children in mind? And I think the information here will be a particularly benefit to the client, the benefit of clients at pregnancy centers, because they certainly do think about these issues quite a bit. So moving on to the next slide, characteristics of the dominant dating culture. And then the next slide, which we talk about men and women and so forth. So let's get into some of the stereotypes here, but I think that they're helpful in sort of setting the stage.
Sorry,
Hello?
if you don't mind me interrupting. We all are only seeing the first slide still on our screens.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Let's
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just saw it in the chat.
No, that's fine. Thank you for sharing that, because that seems to be my struggle here. Let me stop sharing and try it again. All right. Are you on the dominant dating culture share right now, folks?
I see that, yes.
Okay. All right. We're back to you, Dan. Go
Okay.
right ahead.
Very good. So men just want one thing. Okay, so that's the stereotype, and I think within secular culture, it's largely true. And so men may go about this in different ways. They might be crude and pressure women into doing things that they don't want to do necessarily, or they might play the role of Prince Charming or try to appear to be loving to get what they want. Women, on the other hand, I think enter the dating scene wanting emotional, psychological needs met. They're certainly less single-minded in that sense compared to men. But both genders, I think it can be fairly said, play games to get what they want. And again, we're talking about the dominant dating culture, which is something you may or may not have personally experienced. And these games are manipulative in nature. People try to get the other person to do things that they wouldn't necessarily want to do. For example, men may pretend to be loving when they're not really loving. If you have two suitors, there may be hidden boyfriends or girlfriends in the background. One may be selected and one may be dumped, discarded, if you will. And so there's lots of different games that people play in terms of trying to get what they want. On the next slide, role playing. This plays a big role in it. People will try to pretend to be someone they're not really in the hopes of courting favor or to make a positive impression. Within the culture at large, there's certainly tremendous pressure to act and conform in a certain way. And everyone in the dominant dating culture experiences that. But I think at the heart of everyone's behavior, everyone who's in this culture, they're constantly preoccupied with the question, what's in it for me? And what drives it is selfishness and self-gratification. Folks are always moving on, look on the prowl, as it were, looking for someone better. It's a very consumer-oriented culture in which people are practically viewed as produce. We select this person, we discard this person, and on it goes. Next slide, please. And I would argue that people are not treated well at all, to put it mildly, and that selfishness is really most clearly manifested in that the underlying relationships are discarded, and by implication, people themselves are viewed as being disposable. In other words, we can just get rid of them whenever we want to. And thinking about this some more, it occurred to me that this is true of the way we view a lot of relationships in life. It can be true within a marriage, where one party or the other decides, you know what, this is it, I'm done, just dispose of this other person, move on. We see this, don't we, with the life issues as well. Elderly get to a point in their lives where no one's interested, no one cares, and it's viewed as acceptable or justifiable in some sense just to dispose of them and move on. And I guess it goes without saying, but let me say it anyway. I think the view of the unborn can also quite easily fall into this category where they're just viewed as a problem. Let's dispose of them. Let's solve the problem, as it were, that way, and move on. And so this, of course, this view of human beings, human life, human relationships as things that can be just discarded and disposed of is really quite horrible, to say the least, but unfortunately a very pervasive attitude. And so on the next slide, how does this culture manage to function at all? I can give you a partial answer to that, and because if you think about why should this culture even work, right? If everyone that enters into it is selfish, and instinctively we recoil from people who are selfish and try to manipulate us, you might ask, well, how does this culture, even this dominant dating culture, even manage to function? And I think a partial answer to that is that men and women enter into kind of an exchange. In other words, they say, okay, I've got this, she's got that, and vice versa, and they kind of enter into an exchange, and it's regulated by what I call the social totem pole. And stated crassly, it's all about sex in exchange for money. That's sort of the stereotype. A rich guy, okay, he's got lots of money, lots to offer in terms of financial benefit, and the woman brings her own set of assets to the exchange, and then they enter into this exchange. You see that in Hollywood, for example, where rich people enter into a prenuptial agreement even before they're married. They agree to the terms of divorce even before they are married, and it's really an exchange. It's not really an act of love, and so what goes into the social totem pole? Well, for women, largely it's how they look, their appearance, perhaps their personality as well. For men, it'd be a combination of things: financial, good looking, athletic, and so forth. And if we think back to high school, it's perhaps easier to visualize this sort of arrangement and how things were, how we experienced them at that time. And so, there's a certain class at the top and there's a certain group at the bottom, and they don't have much to do with each other. And I think it's true, looking at the second half of this slide, that folks tend to seek out those who are near their level on the social totem pole. In other words, if you're at the top, maybe you're really rich or whatever, then you're probably not likely to seek out someone at the bottom of the totem pole. And so people tend to seek out someone who's more or less at their level, if you will, on the totem pole. You don't go too far down because that's beneath your dignity. People on the top of the totem pole, well, you see, you don't approach them unless you're at the top, because to do so would be presumptuous. You're overstepping your grounds. So I want to, on the next slide, let's continue with this thought a little longer. Our social totem pole, this represents our worth in the social marketplace. And it acts to facilitate, the social totem pole acts to facilitate this exchange between men and women, boys and girls, rather than to facilitate a gift of love. So on the next slide, how important is love to dating? Frankly, true friendship is often optional, at least in the initial stages, and may not even be important at all. What this leads to, among other things, is what I call serial dating, and this foreshadows serial marriages. Look at how people practice dating. I'm going out with this person, they didn't work out, dump them, move along, try somebody else. You're just trying out people, as it were, trying out relationships, and we see that in marriage too, don't we? Well, it didn't work out, so you go through a series of marriages. In the dominant dating culture, romance is elevated above friendship, and now it's even gone further to the sex is elevated above romance. It's another one of the characteristics that friendship is shortchanged, generally speaking. And so we don't necessarily think about a friendship, a relationship that includes both friendship and romance. It's not necessarily the first thing that comes to our mind when we think about dating. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. On the next slide, a certain phoniness. So people enter into these social relationships and dating relationships wanting to have something, and the gap between what we want and what we have, it might tempt us to be less than genuine, to suffer from a lack of integrity, because we want something, and so if we pretend to be someone we're not, maybe we think we have a better chance of getting that, and so we're tempted to pass ourselves off as people other than who we really are. And then on the next slide, sort of to sum up a bit, I mean, you could talk about this for a long time, but dating, as I see it, it's all too common. It involves selfishness masquerading as love. In other words, people pretending to love when they really have a hidden agenda or something else in mind, and it's being driven by selfishness, by self-centered desires. And the short of it is that people are used instead of being truly loved in the unconditional sense. So on the next slide, I talk about personal reflections and go back to the question I posed in high school: is it really true that all is fair in love and war? And I'm afraid a lot of people have sort of bought into that, at least within limits. They might not agree to the premise in toto, but in part, maybe that's okay. I mean, up to a certain point, maybe this kind of thinking is okay, or so we're invited to believe. So, I went through the Sunday school and so forth, and then, people retain something of what they've learned in church, and certainly they know something about the importance of loving God and loving their neighbor. That sort of gets short shrift in the dating years, and then at some point, most will find themselves engaged and may go through premarital counseling. But in my experience, talking to people and so forth, by the time they get to the premarital counseling stage, we're sort of playing cleanup in a sense, because they haven't necessarily internalized the importance of unconditional love and friendship to relationships. They've sort of bought into this notion that it's okay to manipulate the other person within limits. Let's see what we can get away with, both spiritually and physically. And it may not be until the premarital counseling phase that they've actually confronted some of these issues for the first time. Most will choose to get married, and so they enter marriage with potentially a lot of baggage that has to be then worked out. And so one of my theses is that it really would be better for all concerned to start thinking about these issues up front, before we get engaged, before we start spending more time with with others and learn what it means to love unconditionally, the importance of that as it relates to our Christian faith, so that we enter into all relationships with the proper perspective and save ourselves a lot of grief in the long run. And so I'd like to expand on that a little bit in terms of what Christian teaching would tell us on the next slide, titled "A Contrast with Christian Teaching and Practice." So what about love? I mean, we know the great commandments. We're to love God, we're to love our neighbor. Does this really apply to dating, though? And I think for most people, they'd have to pause and really think of that, because it's not a question that we would naturally answer in the affirmative necessarily. So on the next slide, should we love our neighbor when dating? Well, the secular world would say no. I mean, they might give lip service to love, but in fact, they really do believe that all is fair in love and war. That's why we have the adage. And so you do whatever you feel is right. I would argue that Christianity, viewed with any kind of intellectual honesty at all, would compel us to answer the question in the affirmative. Of course, we must love our neighbor when dating. There's no carve out when it comes to dating. You read the biblical passages on this, and there's no exception there. No exception says, well, if it's hard to love your neighbor, then don't do it. Or if you're in a romantic relationship, then that's okay. No, there's none of that. And so I think we need to take that to heart. There's really no exception to the golden rule when it comes to lovers, that we really do and are expected to love our neighbor regardless. And so this is first of what I would consider to be sort of a radical idea, if you will, because it's such a radical departure from the way that the world does things. On the next slide, I say loving our neighbor. In some sense, I mean, that's just a starting point, isn't it? Because if you read the Old Testament and New Testament, love in the community of faith is always worked out in a larger context, right? You don't have Lone Ranger Christians. You're working together within a faith community, brothers and sisters in the Lord. And so all the relationships then should ideally work towards a larger community, a community of believers in which we view ourselves as brothers and sisters with a certain kind of equality before God. So on the next slide, I pose another question. What are dating and romance if they're not accompanied by love? So let's look at some answers to that, which you'll see on the next slide, where I have contrasted what the secular world believes versus what Christianity would teach. And certainly it's true, isn't it, that we're invited to believe that we should get something out of a relationship. Think about that. We're supposed to get something out of it, right? In its crudest form, we hear this with respect to sexual partners. You should get something out of each one of them before you move on. But this is clearly at odds with the sentiment that in giving of ourselves we receive, which you see in the Bible, especially in New Testament teaching. We don't receive until we give of ourselves. It's not a question of getting something out of a relationship. It's the issue is, are we giving? Are we giving of ourselves? Also, I think secular culture would tell us to love things and use people. I mean, certainly we're bombarded with that all the time, aren't we? Look at people's garages and you can tell what they love. They've got all sorts of things tucked away there that they love. At the same time, unfortunately, our society's fallen into the trap of using people. But we should be doing just the opposite, right? We should be using things. The universe was created in part for our enjoyment. We're to have dominion over it, and we're to use things and to love people, not the opposite. In secular society, human worth is based on social merit. You think back to the social totem pole and how people rank and how they are ranked. But that's not Christian teaching, is it? We read in the Bible that human beings have intrinsic worth. We were created in the image of God, and Christ died for us, and for those reasons, we have intrinsic worth. It has nothing to do with the social totem pole or where people may rank us. That's not what defines us, biblically speaking. Continue these sentiments, and on the next page,
Hey, Dan, would you
yes,
would you say that in our age of woke political thought, that social merit is based not on the intrinsic value and worth, but on just what the social idea is for that particular moment and what happens to be acceptable or wanted to be focused on?
yeah, really, that's a great point. And we're seeing that every day, aren't we? And the criteria are constantly changing. So someone may say something today which is accepted, which 5 years from now may not be. So yes, people are used, discarded in the context of political aims as well. And this is very disturbing. In fact, even the purveyors of these kind of totalitarian ideologies, which I believe is underlying a lot of what we're seeing, really, would even admit that people are just to be used. I mean, you go back to Lenin's phrase, certain people are useful idiots. You just use them, discard them, and advance your goals. It really is horrifying to see this act out in the political sphere.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. So on the next page, I say self-centered versus selfless. Um, so sure, I mean, people enter into these different relationships in a self-centered way. It's what can I get? What's in it for me? Which of course is the complete opposite of being selfless. Along with this is sort of a live for the moment mentality. You just do what feels good at that moment. But it's hard to read the Bible and not get a sense of a longer term sense of history and eternity and values that last. Right? I think that there's a huge contrast between values that last and just doing something for at the moment. That's like day and night. So to kind of wrap this up, love is an exchange in the secular world and for many people, but we speak of unconditional love within the Christian faith, and love is to be an unconditional gift, not something that's to be exchanged. And to the extent that we exchange love, it's not really unconditional, is it? It's conditional, and so that's a crucial point to keep in mind. Finally, people are disposable in the secular world for a variety of reasons. They might be disposable at work. They might be disposable in the political sense. You see how quickly politicians fall out of grace if something goes wrong, or some quip or something they maybe didn't say quite right. But we're supposed to love our neighbor, and that is one of the great commandments. And I think, let me just make a point here to sort of tie this into the pro-life message. I think that if people realize these differences, as I've tried to sort of outline them here, between secular values and Christianity, I think if people appreciated and understood these differences, I think there would be many fewer broken relationships, and as a result, many fewer unwanted pregnancies. And I think that would only help society in a variety of ways.
And would you mind unpacking the love as an exchange? I know your book does that a little bit more.
Okay, an exchange. So again, in sort of the crassest example of that is when a rich Hollywood star, let's say a man, marries a trophy wife, some beautiful woman, and so he gets the trophy wife. He gets sex, okay, and she gets a lot of money, and so there's certain things that one party brings to the table and certain things that another party brings to the table, and so it's sort of an unspoken agreement, generally speaking, that I get something the other person gets something, and we're just exchanging the benefits here, and that's perhaps the best we can do, but that's the exchange. And I think that sort of thinking probably underlies, frankly, a lot of marriages, especially for folks who have been in the dating culture for very long. They get to the point where they realize, I'm not going to get everything I want in life. What's the best I can do? And they find someone with a similar mentality, with perhaps a different set of attributes and positives, and they at least in the back of their minds are saying, okay, we're going to work this out. This is the best I can do, and let's move forward on that basis.
Thank you.
So I think we're on the next slide now. Secular world versus Christianity, which values really work in a relationship and or marriage?
Yes.
Now here's the amazing thing. While society is on the one hand embracing this selfish notion of relationships and marriage and the unborn and you name it, the truth of the matter is, deep down, everybody knows what works, and I can prove it to you. So imagine a couple is having trouble in their marriage and they go to a marriage counselor. No marriage counselor worth his or her salt would ever say to them, you know what, I think the problem here is that you need to be more selfish. Sir, I think you really ought to try an affair or two. That might enrich the marriage. And the missus, I think you really ought to think more of yourself and distance yourself more from the family and the children and just do what you want to do. No one would be in business very long if they adopted that attitude. So you see, the marriage counselors, whether they're Christian or not, know that you have to be willing to sacrifice, to let go of selfish attitudes if you want to make a go of it. And it's interesting, isn't it? When it gets down to brass tacks, everyone seems to realize what really works and what doesn't. Let me turn now to the next page, a short history of marriage, courtship, and dating. And as I said, I want this to be informational, but also inspirational, because you're going to see here the role that the church has played throughout history, and it's quite inspiring. So on to the next page. In Old Testament times, marriages were typically patriarchal, parentally governed, to be sure, but the fathers usually played the dominant role. And arranged marriages were not uncommon. We see that especially in the early chapters of Genesis. But that changed over time, over thousands of years, and certainly by the time of Jesus. That Hebrew order, if you want to call it that, had given way, and men and women were giving their consent to get married to each other. The individual had a much larger role to play, and so parents had a secondary role at that point, which is not to say they weren't important, but they were no longer calling all the shots necessarily. Now, on the next page, we see that something similar was going on in secular culture, if you will. The Roman Republic, which spanned the 5 centuries before Christ, that 500-year period, paternal control in particular was very strong. Men in Roman society, in the Roman Republic, had extraordinary control over their families. In principle, they could even sell their children if they wanted to. I mean, they called the shots. That was it. But that gave way. And so by the time of the Roman Empire, the 5 centuries after Christ, parents continued to have an important say, but consent of the to-be marrieds, the man and the woman, became increasingly important. And so they were not simply given away in marriage anymore. They had a say in the matter as well. Unfortunately, divorce was rather common in Roman society, but the church was opposed to divorce. And gradually the church's view won out. And I find this very encouraging, because we're living in a culture now that is in some ways increasingly hostile to the church. But You know, you talk about cancel culture back in the Roman era. That was cancel culture had a whole nother meaning when they would come after you and kill you in a worst case. So the church faced incredible odds, and yet was able to make a tremendous difference over the long term. It didn't happen overnight or with one tweet. It was a long, hard slog, but in the end, the church won that argument. And even today, people will admit that divorce is not ideal. On the next page, in some sense, it was even tougher slogging when you go north of the Roman Empire. We had Germanic tribes which were heathen, and they were called heathen for a reason. They had concubines, they had multiple wives. Young folks did not have a say necessarily in who they got married to, but the church opposed all of that. The church promoted the idea that it should be one man and one woman, and they emphasized the need for the consent of bride and groom, as opposed to the tribal view, which was, this is essentially, our property. We can sell our daughters for a price, and again, over time, over the many decades and centuries, the church won out against incredible odds. On the next page, talk about the Middle Ages. And during the Middle Ages, economic realities were very important to young folks. I mean, there wasn't a lot of rich people unless they owned the castles or the royalty, and so this weighed heavily on folks' minds. It didn't lend itself to dating, because people just were concerned, frankly, with how to stay alive. And so economic realities played a big part in terms of who you married. But while that was happening, the church continued to maintain that the bride and groom should have a say in who they married, and they also began in the late Middle Ages to emphasize the importance of loving relationships in marriage between husband and wife, and the importance of having children. And this was true of both Catholic and Protestant traditions. They were both preaching this, and those views eventually won out as well. Let's go to the next slide, where I talk about the Enlightenment. And so the bad news here is that in the last few hundred years, the secular forces have started to push back. The Enlightenment promoted a more secularized view of the world and marriage. And in the 1700s, folks married for love. Now, at first glance, that doesn't sound bad necessarily, but what happened is that the larger sense of community and family started to get diluted, and people viewed it more as a private affair in some sense. We're going to marry each other for love, and so that was a bit of a chink in the armor, if you will. In the 1800s, people started to elevate the importance of romance. In other words, it wasn't just love, but romantic love became important. And in the 1900s, the last century, that love became sexualized. And that you see, there's a certain logical progression to this if you accept the initial understanding of if you downplay the importance of unconditional love, you start to see how this sort of flows naturally. We go from love, whatever that may be, to romance, to its sexualization. Now, on the next page, I talk about courtship and dating in the United States, and we're going to see that something very similar to the marriage evolution, if you will, is happening in courtship and dating. In other words, the stages that precede marriage. And so that in the United States in the late 1700s and the colonial times in the early 1800s, it was very important. The family and community were very important to the process. This is where young men and women would meet, in family homes, in the community, in the schoolhouse. Friendship and love were both important to couples. And in the course of my research, I was surprised to learn, I find this really fascinating, that romance was considered immature. And if you'd ask someone in colonial eras, about romance, or if a couple had come to you and say, you know, we're romantically in love and we're going to get married, that would have been greeted with real puzzlement. It's like, what? So what's the connection, right? They didn't view marriage that way. Romance was not what was driving the relationship. And on the next page, where I say the mid to late 1800s, this is where romance actually won out over friendship. And so in the early 1800s, romance novels were all the rage, and this started changing people's thinking about the role of romance in a relationship. And so after a few decades of romance novels, people started to view the relationships differently, and eventually you got to the point where people viewed romance as the primary driver, and that should definitely be a precursor to marriage. And even our language started to change. It's fascinating that before the mid 1800s, the phrase "just friends" never appears. I mean, no one used the phrase. You hear that these days, right? We're just friends, as if to say, you know, we're not romantically involved. No one talked like that before the mid 1800s. Just friends, mere friendship. These kind of terms appeared as a result of this cultural shift and the shift in thinking.
Dan,
Yes.
How do we want to view romance in these terms? Is it just the exciting, the titillating, the lusting, with your eyes? What is it?
Yeah, good point. I mean, it really depends on your view of romance and whether it's positive or negative. I mean, there certainly can be a negative aspect to it, right? And you threw out the word lust. I mean, that's clearly negative. I would argue that the positive romance would be grows out of a healthy attraction for someone that is preceded by friendship. I mean, that's the ideal. I mean, no one can deny that there's sexual attraction between men and women. That's how God created it. But as far as romance goes, I would argue that, and I'm going to get into this more later, that the ideal should be friends first, and that romance may or may not grow out of that. And if it doesn't, that's fine. Yeah, and so I was fascinated in the research to learn the following little tidbit, that in the mid 1800s, first of all, honeymoon trips were not common, but when they happened, get this, it often worked like this: the bride and groom would invite friends and family along, and they would visit. They would visit other relatives. Excuse me. That was just incredible to me. I mean, that is so far removed from what we have now. And so by the 1880 or so, honeymoon trips were being taken to so-called romantic locations in which the bride and groom would sort of self-isolate each other from family, from friends, from the community. But you can see there's a certain downside to that, right? Because they're sort of cutting themselves off in a sense. And so this sense of relatives and community continues to erode, and you can see that in the way they practice their honeymoons. I thought that was really incredible because no one would do that today. In fact, couples today will sometimes keep it a secret where they're going just so that no one shows up, right? The good news is that as far as the 1800s goes, is that companionship and values were still important. Even as the rest of this was going on, they continued to value certain things. And on the next page, I talk about sort of the last phase of courtship in the United States, which has been called calling. And this is a completely different tradition in which women, believe it or not, took the initiative. So a suitor, a male suitor, did not come to the woman's house unless he was invited by the woman. Isn't that amazing? So the women had control of the process, and this was very common in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Completely backwards compared to what we have today in some sense. And on the next page, I talk about this courtship process giving way to what we might call dating, which in turn has evolved in various ways. And And so men took the initiative in dating. They paid for everything, and women felt obligated to pay them back in some sense through sexual favors or what have you. So this was very, very demeaning in some sense. So character attributes were de-emphasized during this period, and the good news, I guess, is there was no strong pressure to form couples, at least. But on the next page, we'll see that going steady became the ideal, and so there was entertainment, there was something to eat, amorous behavior. On the next page, next slide, dating goes sexual, and that's the sexual revolution. So that's very unfortunate to say the least, and it's gone even further now beyond what we might have experienced as a country in the 1960s. Now it's the hooking up culture in which friendship is essentially non-existent. There's sex first, and maybe there's some kind of meaningful contact later. On the next slide, I begin a discussion of a better approach to relationships. And on the next slide, I suggest we get ready, get set, and go slowly. And then I pose a question on the subsequent slide: how should we relate to others in general? And the answer, I believe, is that we need to keep in mind the great commandments of loving God and loving our neighbor. And then on the next slide, the benefits of learning to love. I think it's very important that we do these, keep these commandments in mind. As folks that are thinking about dating, or however they might phrase it, we learn a lot of things that are very helpful to the process. First of all, that our worth depends on God and not what others think of us. I mean, people in social groups, they're always concerned about how they're being evaluated, how they're viewed, and so forth. But it's important to internalize that our worth as human beings depends on what God thinks about us, not what others think about us. And that's liberating too, isn't it? Because then we're free to be ourselves. As long as you're captive to someone else's thoughts, or prisoner to what they think, then you're never really free to be yourself in the positive sense of the phrase. And I think we also learn, as we learn to love, that romance is not the thing that's going to fulfill us, or sex. Those things are not going to fulfill us at the deepest level. And then that in turn allows us to view other people not as sex objects, but as human beings. Continuing the thoughts on the next page. As we learn to love, we think about what we can give and not what we can get, and that certainly makes life a lot easier. It makes the relationship a lot better, doesn't it? We learn to value all people, not just those at the top of the social totem pole or aspire to be at the top, but to value people as individuals, as human beings. And we also come to recognize the importance of friendship and become less selfish and more loving. All of those things, I think, are important to developing a positive relationship. On the next page, I just mentioned Christian character and maturity. I think it's really foundational to successful relationships that we learn to develop Christian character, that we learn to be mature. That leads to self-respect for ourselves, self-respect for others. It allows us to be honest. We learn patience. It's always a good thing when you're dealing with human beings. The importance of wisdom, and in a sense, then we're free to embrace life, aren't we? And to have interests. On the next page, I suggest that developing many friendships is actually a very good thing based on unconditional love. Let's harken back to the brother-sister model for relationships, to be family in God and Christ. The brother-sister relationships in the context of community, I think, is the biblical ideal, and that should be foundational to our dealings. Now, on the next page, I outline one possible marriage script, but with a disclaimer. There's all these how-to books out there. If you do this, that, and the other thing, then you're guaranteed that Mr. Wonderful or Ms. Wonderful. And that I view those as really misleading, because they're encouraging people to believe that it just depends on doing things in a certain way and a certain methodology, and then you're guaranteed success. But life doesn't work like that. In any area of life, it doesn't work like that. Nevertheless, I've outlined one possible marriage script that might apply to many folks and perhaps resonates with you. I think that meeting each other in a group setting, I think is a great place to start, whether that be in church or somewhere else. You get to know something about the other person at a distance, and then you learn to get to know them better by engaging in conversation, and perhaps over time you develop a friendship, or perhaps not. And if the friendship continues, perhaps you become best friends, or perhaps not. And I think at the best friend stage, it might be appropriate to consider marriage. But I would advise young people this way. I would say if you're not marrying your best friend, that's not ideal. You really do want to marry your best friend. You don't have to marry your best friend, but marrying your best friend, I think, is the ideal, because that is really what should be foundational to marriage. On the next page, just a few other tips. It's very important to think realistically about the other person. If you have this idyllic view of the other person or are infatuated, then please reread Romans, where it says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There are no perfect people on this planet, and you really do need to think realistically about their strengths and weaknesses. Learn to respect each other, learn to communicate. These can take time. Very important to avoid destructive thought patterns, whether that be infatuation or wishful thinking or whatever it might be. And remember that people are fragile. I think it's also important that we all have mentors and other friends who can keep our thinking honest, and above all, marry within the faith. I've known so many who did not do that and have had a lifelong regrets over it. It's just never worked out. On the next page, the need for sexual purity. Let me introduce another radical idea here for you, and that being sexually pure, abstaining from extramarital sex, that is an act of love. And I know it's not viewed that way as just on the contrary. People, they view that as the natural thing to do if you are in love. Why not? Just go ahead and have sex. I would argue just the opposite. And on the next page, sexual purity, I've outlined several ways in which abstaining from premarital sex is actually an act of love. And first of all, I mentioned it's love extended towards God. Now, what does that mean? Well, Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. So we know what's right and wrong in that situation. But think of it this way. When Jesus says, if you love me, obey my commandments, it's an act of love, isn't it, towards God, that we're following his commandments. We love him, and therefore we obey his commandments. It's also love extended towards the church, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't do the church any good when the parishioners are acting like the heathen. Where's the witness in that case? Especially when a pastor or someone in authority gets caught up in something like that, it really more than dilutes the witness. It really embarrasses the church, and it's just hugely negative towards the church. So by abstaining from extramarital relations, we fortify the reputation of the church and give it credibility. Now, the next couple of points are maybe a little more difficult to grasp, but I think they need to be said. Let's say you have a couple, they're in love, maybe they're even planning to get married. Why not just have relations at that point? Why not have sex? But it's love extended to each other if they don't. And let me just touch on a practical example. If they do get married, they may not, but if they do get married, they will have set a good foundation for themselves and for that marriage. Let me tell you, by waiting until marriage, you are building confidence in that marriage. You're building confidence that you won't stray after you get married. Because if you've developed a habit of falling into sexual sin before you get married, it's easier to imagine you might do it after you get married. And your partner, in the back of their minds, they might be thinking, I just don't know. But if you've been faithful to God, faithful to each other before marriage, it really builds the marriage before you are married. It's a confidence builder. Let's think about the other possibility here. Let's say that couple, those two folks, they don't get married. Well, by abstaining from sex, you are enriching the future marriage if one of those folks does get married, because then they enter into a marriage without all that baggage, all that emotional baggage. They don't have to deal with a whole bunch of psychological scars, and it really is an act of love to say no at that moment in that relationship, and contribute in a real way, demonstrative way to that future marriage with that other person. You are extending a gift to them by doing that, and by not robbing them of their gift. And finally, it's love is extended to the unborn, to be procreated, because it really is not ideal to have a situation in which mom and dad are not married, and when the mom has to think about alternatives to childbirth. We want to stay away from that. We want to extend love to those who are to be procreated, as well as those to be born. So on the next slide, by way of contrast, if we instead embrace the ethic that just go ahead and do it and get something out of everyone, as many people as you can, go for all the gusto you can get. If we use and then discard people, I mean, that truly is atrocious, isn't it? To use someone and just to toss them as if they're disposable. What could be more horrifying? And none of us like to be treated that way, and so we should not treat others that way either. Here's another little bullet point: committing fornication is stupid. Okay, so this is something from my mother. She always used to say. She told us when we were growing up, when a young woman has sex before marriage, she used to say it's stupid first and sinful second. Now, let me qualify that. She wasn't saying that there are different rules applied to men and women. And what she was saying, she was alluding to the different mentality that many women have about sex. So for men, many of them anyway, it's more transactional. This is why prostitutes have customers, after all. But for women, some of them are tempted to believe that if they have sex before marriage, that somehow it's going to capture that guy or deepen the relationship. But if those women understood better how men think about sex, they wouldn't be tempted to do that. And so it's stupid, because they're not going to get what they really want, which is a deeper relationship. For men, it's stupid too, as well, isn't it? Because deep down, they want a more meaningful relationship. If cornered, they'll admit they want something that eventually, a marriage or a relationship that's going to last. And so it's just stupid all around. So thanks to my mother for that insight. In terms of how couples should interact, there's different folks have proposed different schemes. What you can do and can't do. I would just say this, that physical activity before marriage should not be sexually arousing, but I think physical contact is part of the human experience, right? You hug your brothers, your sisters, your parents. I think it's fine to be tender and affectionate in your contact, but not sexually arousing. And I would leave it at that, rather than start assigning numbers or something to different kinds of things that you could do or not do. Finally, on the next page, a counterculture with children in mind. Think now about how the church won those various cultural battles. And so I think it behooves us to think about how are we going to, what is our witness? How do we win, so to speak, the cultural battle and reach people? And so I've just ticked off some things that I think are important as we construct our own counterculture. And I use the word advisedly because, we're called ambassadors for Christ in the New Testament. So what does that mean? It means we're in a place that's not really our home, right? If you're an ambassador, you're in a different country. And so we're never going to be truly at home here. We're going to be ambassadors for another culture. And so that's why I call it counterculture. We're always going to be opposed in some sense to what's going on around us. I think our counterculture has to be grounded in unconditional love for God and love for our neighbor. And a lot of things flow from that. There's certainly the importance of friendship, godly values, taking responsibility for our own behavior. You hear a lot about rights. You hear very little about responsibility. I think that says a lot. If I could identify one thing for people to work on or view as perhaps most important, it would be the importance of delayed gratification. We live in a society now where everything has to be instant, right? We've got credit cards that will buy you that thing right now. You don't have to work for it, we're told. But realistically, everything in life that's worth anything takes time and effort. You don't just get a college degree for nothing. You have to work for it. You don't just get a job for nothing. You have to be qualified. And you don't just fall into a good marriage either. There's a certain set of character attributes and hard work in a sense that you trials, if you will, you've experienced through life that bring you to the point where you can enjoy those things. And so very important that folks learn to delay gratification and not just give in at the first sign of trouble or temptation. And finally, for Christian parents, it's so important that we set a good example, not just for our kids, but for society, that we not fall into the divorce culture, and to provide that alternative that the culture so desperately needs to see. On the next page, as Pastor Duncan mentioned, the book I wrote, the ebook at least, is free. Anyone in the U.S., if you go onto Amazon, it's completely free. All you need is the Kindle Reader, which is also free. And if you have an Amazon account, which you can also get for free, you can download the Kindle Reader and the ebook, all for free. That's today, tomorrow. If you've got friends, relatives, neighbors, whatever, tell them that you can get it for free today, tomorrow, and then after that it goes back to the normal price. So it's available to anyone in the U.S. For whatever reason, you can't download ebooks outside the U.S., and so there's that sort of geographical limitation. But anyone in the U.S., anyone at all, can go ahead and download that today, tonight, or tomorrow for free. And I also want to mention this. My wife and I have made it our ministry to donate the book, hard copies, if you will, to the clients of crisis pregnancy centers. So if you work at a crisis pregnancy center and you think that the young women and men who come would benefit from this, and the center has a sort of a program whereby counselors will sit down and talk to them, we're happy to donate the books for free to those centers. This works ideally in situations where clients come in and have weekly sessions. Let's say they agree to come in and be counseled over 2, 3, 4 week period, whatever. Then this can be material that they can read at home, come back into the center, discuss. There's discussion questions at the end of each chapter that will help focus the mind and get them thinking. And also give it away to full-time Christian vocational workers. That includes pastors, DCEs, you name it, principals at Christian high school. I mean, anyone you think would benefit from this, I'm happy to give them a free copy as well, as long as our finances hold out, that is. Obviously, if 1 million people come to us, we'll have to rethink the offer. But for now, that's a standing offer. at the clients of crisis pregnancy centers and full-time Christian vocational workers. We're happy just to give them a copy. And then, of course, everyone who wants to download one today, tomorrow from Amazon is free to do so. Last page, you can contact me through my website. Dan, that's my nickname or first name, if you will. Good Books, bit of a play on words there. dangoodbooks.com. And there's the cover in case you're looking for a visual to match the book with the cover. So that's all the prepared comments I had, but be happy to hear your comments and questions.
Dan, thank you for sharing that presentation. I appreciated all that you had put into it. You asked a question, and I want everybody else to kind of consider this. At the end of your first chapter, you put in a question. Imagine a world in which there was no true love at all, no unconditional love, and people were always selfish. What are your thoughts about that, folks? Is that kind of the world that we see ourselves headed to at this point?
I think that that's pretty much what's happening generally with today's society. I feel like in a lot of aspects, especially in my age group, I'm 18, a lot of people view it as more of a, you get what you get, you live on, you go on, you do what you gotta do type of thing. And I feel like people look at it as a job, not as a relationship between God and your significant other, if you know what I'm referring to. I don't appreciate that in today's society, but sadly, I feel like that's what it's leading to. And that's why I feel like you have to really have a stronghold on, like my parents, stronghold on our children, stuff like that, understanding God has importance in your life and have to have them stated in there.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I appreciate everything you just said. I'm sorry I can't see names here on the screen anymore, but you know, as Christians, we can form our own culture, and I really hope we can continue to do that. And you know, we don't. I guess one of the insights for me as a young person growing up is, you know, whoa, it's like, wait a minute, I don't have to join this culture. I mean, it seemed at the time like I had to, right? Because that was the only game in town, and I didn't want to be left out. But later, as I matured in the faith, I realized, you know, you can be you know, you can form your own culture based on godly biblical values. You don't have to be beholden to what everyone else is telling you, and that has been in college especially. There were different Christian-oriented groups, and these people are just wonderful because they lived their lives like that. They really didn't care what the other people were doing insofar as it influenced their behavior. They knew what was the right thing to do, and they did it. It was so refreshing.
What other questions might any of the participants have for our author, Dan?
Question. I was wondering what you thought, Dan, about like the phrase opposites attract, because you mentioned a lot of like common qualities that you should have. But I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I guess that phrase can mean different things to different people, can it? Opposites attract. I mean, there's certainly a sense in which, well, first of all, men and women, right? I mean, you can think of them as opposites, I suppose, in some sense. They're complementary to each other. And I think there's something to be said for being attracted to someone who complements you in a way that maybe enriches the couple, if you know what I mean. If you're just clones of each other, maybe that's kind of boring. So if there are differences, that makes the relationship more interesting. Having said that, I want to mention something that is very interesting, that psychologists will tell you that you are more likely to be attracted by someone who looks like you than someone who does not look like you. And this actually happened to me. My wife and I had been best friends for a long time, and we're going to get married. And then it dawned on me, she looks like me. I mean, she could almost be my sister. So in that sense, I'm not sure opposites attract. But when it comes to personality, I think there's something to that. But I'd have to define that more, I think, more carefully before opining too much, because there's a lot to consider. There's what people look like, it's their personality, it's their value system, and so on. And sometimes what's complementary may be helpful, and sometimes maybe not so much.
Okay, thank you.
Anna, do you have any particular thoughts on opposites attracting, and does that concern you in a particular way?
Not really. I think the first thing that's important is being equally yoked and like sharing that common faith. So I mean, I'm 18 as well, like Elisa. And so I was just thinking the other day about like qualities that I would look for in my future husband after that shared faith. And so I'm a pretty outgoing person. So I'm like, do I need to look for a shy person? So that's just kind of my thinking.
Gotcha. I particularly like this concept, and it's not something that should be unusual or foreign to us, but the idea of groups getting together and doing activities within a group, not necessarily for the purpose of finding a mate, but with the eyes or the view in mind that from these shared activities, you may indeed find somebody of common interest, personality, the idea that you get to see a person actively engaged with other people, and you see the way that they treat each other. You see the way that they have interactions with both people of their own sex as well as people of the opposite sex. You really get to kind of experience what that person is like in a safe setting, and how they're going to act on a regular basis, so that you can also maybe make that jump or conclusion that this might be some of the way that they would treat their spouse or their family members, or the people who are significant in their lives, if they're treating people who may not be quite as significant and just held on a friendship or a close companionship level. What do you guys think of that?
I can speak from my own experience. When my future husband and I were dating, I was a teacher and in charge of the cycling club at my high school. And we decided to work together to plan a trip that was like 250 some miles over a period of days, and with a great destination at the end. And we ended up taking students on that. And just the whole idea of working together on a project was really a good way for us to get to know each other.
Excellent. Others?
Like, for example, my older brother and his fiance, they've been engaged now. Right when COVID hit is when he proposed. And they've been best friends since they were 3 years old, the both of them, and had a really hard time. And they went on a common ground of understanding that they're both going through college, and then COVID hit. So they looked at it as a timing of, okay, we'll use this as a time to focus on the actual college rather than, doing this. Or some people elope and some people do that. So they made it a project to the gist of, they discussed wedding plans and college without forcing everything into a thing. So it became like a project together. So now that they're back from college, they're on the same page, and they got to know, oh, I didn't know they liked X, Y, and Z. I don't, or I do. You know what I mean?
Excellent.
Can you hear me? I would like to share something.
Yes, we can. Thank you, Becky.
Okay. I often love to write Genesis 2, verse 18, I think it is, in wedding cards, because I love that God said that it is not good for man to be alone. I will create a help. In the older versions, King James, they use the word help mate or help meet.
Mm-hmm.
I will create a help mate for him. And I find that to be one of the best definitions of marriage, that you are mated for life to help each other. So even at the beginning of the journey, when you're looking at young men or young women as a prospective person to date, how well how much are, it's like the unconditional love. Are they willing to help? Because life is a helping relationship all throughout your marriage.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you.
Great.
I don't want to be, utilitarianism in the sense of what our life teams or our life chapters could be doing. But as we're engendering the care for the other, as we proclaim what Dan has proposed here, which is the biblical proposition that we love God and we love our neighbor as ourselves. And we certainly, through our life teams and our life chapters, teach the thought of loving our neighbor by caring for them from fertilization to their natural death, by advocating that we support agencies that care for our neighbor, and that we put our time, our resources into helping equip others, changing our culture, and then going out and actually going arm in arm, side by side to do this work. One of the good purposes that I can see out of this is to have a life team and then extend into life chapters where our young people and our adults can both be sharing these experiences together and finding other like-minded people to share their life with. Maybe some of them will eventually meet and decide to have a friendship and extend it into marriage. But this is an excellent place to begin. Why we would have a life team where these activities can happen, and why we would have chapters within our cities where people from across the city can come together, support the cause for life, while at the same time meeting and encouraging each other in that effort for life as well. Any thoughts or comments on something like that, Dan or others? Okay.
Well, there's no question that the role of community is crucially important. I guess that I defer to others to chime in at that point, but that's certainly an excellent starting point.
All right. Well, does anybody else have any questions for Dan at this time? Comments on the material that has been presented today?
Comment on the material.
Yeah.
Sorry, I talk a lot.
No, you're good.
I actually really appreciated, I actually just ordered it off of Amazon. I really appreciated the material that you wrote about. A lot nowadays when I look at material, trying to figure out, what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong in relationships, or trying to put God in the relationship, because a lot of people look at that as, she's control or this or that. I liked the fact that you actually had it faith-based and you had it standardized throughout the entire reading, as I could tell. A lot of people, they will stay their ground in the beginning and they'll change it up throughout the book, and then you don't actually understand what the book was about, and you don't even know what you're saying. And I appreciated the fact that you had it faith-based, and the purity throughout it was very clear, and I appreciated that very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. Dan, there has been a couple of questions, and I just want to make sure that I'm saying the right thing. If somebody wants to get a copy for their pastor or for their DCE, how should they do that? Should they go on to dangoodbooks.com and give you a name and an address, or what would be best?
That works. The quickest way actually would be to shoot them an email and ask them to download it for free, because they can do that today, tomorrow, all day tomorrow. So that certainly works. But otherwise, I encourage people to contact me through the website. Just go to the website, and there's a contact page, and then just shoot me an email, and we can go from there.
Okay, so yes, definitely encourage anybody that you know could benefit from the book to get the ebook which doesn't cost Dan. Does it cost you money to offer that ebook, Dan, through Amazon? I'm not sure.
No, it doesn't, and Amazon doesn't make anything. So it's just they allow so many days a year you can offer it for
Oh.
free. And so when I have the opportunity to talk before groups or even larger groups, then I like to throw that out there for people. This is not a business for me. This is ministry. So
Sure.
I try to get it out there as best I can. So it's free periodically and tomorrow for sure.
Okay, well, good. So then folks can send the link for the free ebook and get that out to your pastors and DCEs and tell them that there is a limited time. The offer expires like a pumpkin at midnight tomorrow night, right? Okay.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
And please, if I could just mention again to the group, if you're involved with pregnancy crisis pregnancy centers, and you think this would be helpful to the clients, then by all means ask the director. And I'm looking forward to hearing from directors. I work with a number of clinics here in San Jose. Actually, it's like one umbrella organization and several local outlets, and they've accepted a few dozen copies. And as I understand it, it's going pretty well. And so I love to get it out to the young men and women who frequent those, and certainly Christian pastors, really of any confession, denomination. I'd be happy to do that too, so we can start to chip away at the culture.
And just a note, the Kindle edition was available in Canada on Amazon.ca. So good news.
Oh, wonderful. Was it free? Did they make it free?
Somebody was able to order it. So. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Good news. All right. Folks, we're coming down to the end of our time this evening. We have a question about what is the website again. Dan, you want to tell the website again?
Sure. It's Dan, that's my nickname, dangoodbooks.com. And you can, if you forget that, what you could do is go to Amazon, and there's a link there too. So if you go to the Amazon webpage and type in Disposable Daniel Johnson, then the book will pop up, and you can go from there and get back and find it that way. But it's a Dan, D-A-N, good, G-O-O-D, books, BOOKS.com. dangoodbooks, all one word, .com.
Very good. And I put in the chat that dangoodbooks.com and Disposable When Dating Is Not Loving Your Neighbor as the title. All right. On July 6th, the first Tuesday in July, we will have Reverend Michael Solomon, our Executive Director at Lutherans for Life, speaking the truth in love, engaging abortion advocates, arguments, and objections. And so he'll look at how we can share God's grace sensitively, eloquently, and winsomely in response to many of the things that you have heard people say when it comes to abortion and abortion rights. So we'll look for that on the 6th of July, right after the 4th of July celebration. Dan, I'll stick around here for a few minutes if somebody else wants to stay and ask continued questions. Otherwise, thank you everybody for your time tonight, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next For Life Live. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.